This is the Milk of Lions first video interview. My guest today is Dr. Hyunhee Park. Dr. Park, so you're Associate Professor of History at the City University of New York. You're at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the CUNY Graduate Center. So Dr. Park, thank you for being here.
Hi, Marwan. Thank you for inviting me for the interview.
So, Hyunhee, you wrote Soju A Global History, and that's what we're here to talk about. For those who don't know, Soju is a distilled liquor, a hard liquor from Korea. Very basic. You take rice, you let it ferment, and you get rice wine. Generally, it's based on rice, so rice wine, and then you distill that rice wine to increase its alcohol content, and that gets you soju. So very basic, but we'll talk much more. Now, your book is about the history of soju, but it's much more than just soju, because it's really linking it to the history of alcohol globally, and we'll come back to that. Now, I'll start with going back to a bit of the research I did and how I ended up meeting you. So I've been interested in the history of alcohol, and in particular in Lebanon, where I'm originally from, there is the traditional distilled liquor called Araq. And I always thought, okay, what is the origin of Araq? And first I thought, Araq, that's an Arabic name. So let me go and look in Arabic, very old Arabic sources about the first mentions of Araq. And so I started looking and trying to look at old sources, and it's actually not that easy. There aren't that many very old sources. And then I came across this in your book, which is, so I'm going to try to pronounce his name, Yi Saek.
Yi Saek, yes.
A poet from, yes, okay. So a poet from Korea. So very far from Lebanon, very far from the Middle East. The poet from Korea wrote a poem 600 years ago, mentioning Araq, and I think he calls it Araqi. Now, I have not been able to find mentions of Araq, the Arabic word Araq, as a drink in Arabic sources that are that old, 600 years old. But then I found it in Korea 600 years ago, a poet. So my first question for you, Dr. Park, is what is happening here? How did this Arabic name for a liquor made it all the way to Korea?
Yes, that's a really excellent and fundamental question. So I was also very intrigued to find such a mention in a Korean source in the 14th century. In fact, Araq in Korea came from China that was then ruled by the Mongols. The Mongols also conquered a significant part of Eurasia in the 13th and 14th centuries. Scholars have begun to argue that right before the Mongol period, the Chinese had developed their traditional distilled liquor called xiaozhou, meaning roast liquor or cooked liquor. And then the Chinese also acquired a new southern barbarian xiaozhou, meaning foreign xiaozhou, and it was called Alaji, and it's in Turkic and Mongolian, and actually it's a transliteration of the Arabic word Araq. The Chinese probably acquired this new distilled liquor from foreign countries, from the maritime trade, and wanted to distinguish it from their Chinese, original Chinese xiaozhou. So these distilled spirits, both Chinese xiaozhou and foreign Araq, began to rise as popular beverages in the Mongol period, as the Mongols used them in their rituals and during military expeditions. And then next, xiaozhou and Araq were transferred to Korea that had close connections to the Mongol Empire as a vassal and son-in-law state. As the Mongols brought xiaozhou and Araq to Korea, scholars and merchants from Korea also traveled to the Mongol Empire's capital and brought many new cultural items like xiaozhou and Araq too. Consequently, xiaozhou began to develop as a distinctive spirit in Korea as soju. The Korean word soju is the Korean reading of Chinese xiaozhou. But Arab also came as such and as a generic term to Korea. It is even mentioned where you'd expect it not, like a Korean scholar's poem. Yeah, I was very surprised too. So I was really interested in the fact that in pre-modern Chinese and Korean sources, Xiaozhou and Soju were often identified as Arak. As you know, today Arak is widespread throughout the Middle East and Central Asia and Mongolia and even in the Mediterranean region. I have tried to find the direct link between them, but like you, I have not been able to find West Asian sources before the Mongol period mentioning arak explicitly as a distilled liquor. I only found that people developed distillation in the West using alembic stills. That was very interesting and sophisticated. So in my book, I proposed further studies about the origins of arak and its connections to Asian distilled liquors. And I was so glad to find your father's book, The Milk of Lions. Yeah. So I hope that you can continue exploring the history of arak back to its very origins.
Well, researching alcohol is always great fun, as I'm sure you found out. Very good. Well, that's interesting, and I was fascinated by, I know I'm not a historian, and we always have this view of the Mongols as being these, ruthless warriors. And when I read your book and related research, you realize that they were actually connecting a lot of Asia. And one thing that comes across in your book is how connected the whole of East Asia was, and probably thanks to these Mongols. And there was these exchanges of, cuisine, foodways, and obviously distilled liquors, as you mentioned, all across Asia. Moving around all through these countries.
Yeah, there are many items, and the alcohol is one of many examples. Yeah, that was.
Yeah, and you gave other examples in your book beyond, beyond simply alcohol, right, which again is fascinating. Now, as it turned out, and that was another great chapter in your book, that it's not only Asia. And so I wanted to move from Korea. We're going to go all the way to Mexico and tequila. So we're going to try to link soju, tequila, and maybe we'll bring in Arab in there as well. So, and correct me if I'm wrong. I think the more or less the consensus is that probably the population in the Americas are unlikely to have known distilled liquors or how to distill alcohol before Christopher Columbus discovered the continent and the Europeans colonized it. So there's no evidence. Maybe they did, but highly unlikely. There's no evidence that they knew how to distill alcohol before Christopher Columbus. And so maybe the standard explanation was, look, the Europeans knew how to distill alcohol. Christopher Columbus discovers the Americas. The Spaniards come to Mexico, and so the inhabitants of Mexico probably learn how to distill alcohol from the Spaniards. But tell me about this chapter on book explaining that there's actually another hypothesis that brings us back to Asia.
Yeah, thank you for another good and meaningful question. So like soju, in fact, mezcal and tequila in Mexico are becoming popular in the globalizing world. It's more popular, actually. In fact, the origins of the distilled liquors in Mexico have become a topic for heated international debate. And Dr. Paul Buer is the professor who first introduced me to this topic in the history of distilled alcohol. And he was then collaborating with Dr. Ana Valenzuela. She is an expert of mezcal and tequila in a more comparative distillation project. So Dr. Valenzuela has extensively worked in anthropological field research on underground still production of alcohol in Mexico. And they have pointed out the resemblance of Mexican local stills to East Asian types. And they suggested that Afro-Eurasian distillation methods influenced alcohol development both before and after the arrival of Europeans. I say before and after because some the evidence show like different dates, and so there are a lot of hypotheses still going on. And so I was particularly excited to find out a Mexican steel is quite similar to a traditional Korean steel in its shape, and they looked really similar. So this is how I began to work on the history of soju. And also, that's why I also had to add the chapter about Mexico. That would be another further future comparative study topic. So based on a comparison of the case of Korean soju and Mexican mezcal and tequila, I argue that in the last chapter of my book, why Korean steels did not influence Mexican steels directly, because it's too far. But the two cases actually reveal similar patterns found elsewhere in the development of East Asian steels that spread throughout the Mongol world in Asia. So like the case of Korea, whose transfer route is relatively well documented, the East Asian steels probably influenced distillation in other parts of the world, like Mexico, utilizing various global trade networks. For example, the Manila Galleon, that is Spanish ships that were making annual round trips across the Pacific between Manila in the Philippines and Acapulco in present Mexico from the 16th century. So, that after, so those kind of influence occurred after the Spanish, but some other evidence shows that probably the people there had like distillation practice, but what I had to emphasize in my book is that probably after the Spanish, it began to spread further. Yeah, so we can think about possible origins. So while actually some scholars have suggested independent development of distillation in Mexico from ancient times, natives of the pre-modern Colombian Mexico mostly made fermented beverages based on agave plants before the European contact, and only began to produce and consume distilled liquors at a large scale after the arrival of the Spanish. But as I told you, the topic is open to further research, and the scholars have even attempted to test the ancient origin theory by applying biomolecular archaeological investigations to excavated pottery. So if they prove that it's really true, it's very convincing, then we can really bring the origin date to the very ancient period. But still, they are cautious. Yeah, they have these hypotheses, but they have to make more tests, more investigations to confirm the theory.
Yeah, it's very hard. I mean, I will say it's very hard to prove, and I've seen archaeology it's difficult to kind of spot a distillation equipment 1,000 years later.
Yeah, so the situation is actually similar in Afro-Eurasia, like the scholars, as I mentioned in my chapter 1, scholars also try to find ancient steels in China, and they found some archaeological evidence. And so, but the thing is, when they begin to spread at a large scale, and then if we think about this scale, then we can pinpoint the Mongol period, the 13th and 14th century, like Korea, soju.
Yeah. No, thank you. I will say I like the hypothesis that basically tequila, or the technology for tequila, came from East Asia via the Philippines on Spanish trading ships. That's a nice alcoholic carousel. But no, thank you. Yes, but and also, and I'm going to try to simplify, because I've read a bit of that. It seems to be that when you look at the way Europe or Western Europe started distilling, the equipment was a bit more complicated, right? You know, typically you'll have the alembic, you had a pipe, like I think they call it a serpentine, etc. And I think in Asia, like in soju, it's a more simple thing. You basically you have like a water cooling maybe pot at top, and they noticed that the simpler design was also present in Mexico. So that's why I think they thought, well, maybe that comes from Asia, not from Europe.
Right, exactly. Yeah, you made the point. Yeah, thank you. So the scholars like Paul Buer and Dr. Ana Valenzuela say that those are East Asian style steers. And then Dr. Joseph Needham, in his magnificent work about the civilization, science and civilization in China, so they did really very thorough research about the different types of the steers, and they categorized the main steel types into several. And he mentioned that there are two types that belong to East Asian types: Mongolian type and Chinese type. Chinese type is more complicated. That actually take out the distilled drop outside the pot through the tube, more like sophisticated technology. But the Mongol type is simpler. And as my chapter show, when soju began to spread, actually there are some documentation. That's very interesting. So the Mexican case, we don't have sufficient documentation. So that's why Dr. Valenzuela had to do a lot of field research, anthropological research to trace it. And the Korean soju has, of course, like cultural items, there are not many sources, unlike like political history, but still we have good amount of sources and documentation that help us understand like what kind of technology they use. And it's one documentation describes it. It's very simple. It's Mongolian style in a big pot. They put the lid upside down and take the drop. The drop inside the pot, and it seems very easy. Yeah, of course, until they got the idea, it's not easy to find some new idea, but once they get it, it wouldn't be difficult to spread it to other regions. And so really, the sources in Korea show that from the Mongol period, late Mongol period, and early modern period, Joseon Dynasty. So it seems like soju became popular. It spread quite quickly. Of course, gradually it appears more as numbers, but and then I thought maybe we can compare these patterns. So we can apply this Korean pattern to that of Mexico. And so once whether they had this distillation idea in ancient times or not, we don't know. We need more studies. It's fascinating, but it's safe. So now it's safer to say that it began to spread upon the arrival of the Spanish. So with this like simple idea of Asian distillation. So yes.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. More to research. So I wanted to end this interview with one simple question. I know in your book you asked yourself, what is soju? And I wanted to ask you, what is a traditional drink? You know, again, in Lebanon, you have the zi'ara, that's the traditional drink of Lebanon. And, you know, you've done all this research. So what is for you a traditional drink?
Yeah, that's another excellent and very thoughtful question. So yeah, it's not just about technology, but we have to think about this culture and the influence of the new technology on the society and culture. So, yes, so I have to tell you that indeed, there are two kinds of soju, the modern industrial soju and the revived traditional soju. After Soju and Araq were transmitted to Korea in the Mongol period, the distilled liquors developed in Korea uniquely as soju in the local environment. But traditional distillation was cut off when modern technology was introduced to Korea during the Japanese colonial period in the early 20th century. So since then, the Koreans have had an advanced industrial soju using big machines and technology, and then even began to export it to the global market in the 21st century. So now I ask many friends and colleagues in New York City, most of them know soju. Yeah, some of them like it, but from the late 20th century, the Koreans have also wanted to revive traditional drinks as national folk liquors. And not many people actually had access to that because it's expensive and it's more recent. Um, and many people also in Korea, they had already gotten used to the cheap, industrially made soju. But some people prefer soju made in the traditionally distilled ways because of its deep and smooth taste. But these are all indebted to the same distillation idea that developed from ancient times. That's why I really wanted to write my book from ancient times to the 21st, our own period, because we see a lot of connections. So they share its root with Arak that began to appear in extant documentation from the 14th century. You said Arak is the traditional drink of Lebanon. Yes, I also see Araks in many other countries too. So I hope you and other scholars in the Middle East and other areas can study them further from comparative perspective, tracing the history of their origins and implicit idea exchanges. It would be interesting to see how people in different countries share many endowments of culture and technology in world history. And another issue related to traditional liquor is how to use modern technology to make it. I recently had a chance to buy a bottle of arak at an airport, and the price was relatively low. I was surprised. A big bottle of arak with like 45, 30 or 40 something percent of alcohol.
Yeah.
It's a big bottle at $15. And so I guess it was made by modern technology too, like using continuous stills. Like many distilled liquors, we can buy at reasonable prices. So, like Russian vodka and some Korean new brands of soju, and Mexican tequila too. I learned that also nowadays they use a lot of modern machines to make all this.
Yeah.
But I was also very intrigued to find a new soju brand because you based in New York City, you can also find one in Korean restaurants. It's made by an American brewer. Yeah, and so originally the factory was in Brooklyn, but he moved it to Korea. His name is Brandon here. And so it became quite popular even in Korea. And he used modern distillation machines to make the soju. I put the photo of the machines on my one page in my soju book. He actually, Brandon, provided me with the photo. So he used the modern machines. Looks like a whiskey machine, like a distillation machine. But he followed the traditional recipes. That's very interesting. So using rice and then the nuruk, the Korean fermentation starter. So some people began to debate like, what authentic traditional soju is, and I think actually each person can have different views. Soju, according to what I found, constantly evolved in terms of its ingredients, distillation methods, and technology. So I think we can be flexible about defining traditional drink.
Yeah.
It's not easy to find perfectly authentic foods, as many of them go through transformation based on exchanges of ideas in different times and places. So that makes our life very interesting, especially in the globalized world. So I believe the controversy over traditionalism surrounding this new soju and other kind of the distilled liquors would continue, but I hope it can be done in balanced ways. So so it's important to acknowledge that we are indebted to the traditions and innovations that moved over different societies and periods. So that's why, it's interesting to see history and also global history. So of course, I hope to listen to other opinions regarding the topic and further findings.
No, that's interesting. And I'll tell you, I'll take the example of Lebanon, of Ara. There's this distinction where it's done supposedly the traditional way. They call it Ara Baladi. And then you have the commercial Ara. And I think it's very similar to soju. If you want to do it in a certain traditional way, it's much more expensive. And often it's commercially very hard to sell. But frankly, when I look at it, as you also rightly point, is even the traditional way, it's not like it's been done there since time immemorial in Lebanon. I mean, there's a lot of import from technology from elsewhere, and probably from Asia, and probably from Europe, etc. So, as you said, traditional,
good
it's
topic.
a bit wider.
We can approach it from comparative perspectives.
Okay, but I told you, anytime you want to come, and my father is more than happy to host you at his home distillery. So, excellent. Well, Dr. Park, thank you very much for that interview, and looking forward to reading more about your alcoholic research.
Thank you so much, Marwan. It was my great pleasure, and really thank you for having me. I would love to also read your further researches on Araq, and we can find more connections in the future.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.